want to welcome you all to another Wilson Center on the Hill program. My name's Kent Hughes. I run a program at the Woodrow Wilson Center on America and the Global Economy. So this is a book that really hits a real interest of my own. I want to particularly thank the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation that has really made today possible in our whole series of Wilson Center on the Hill programs, and also extend a thanks to the Woodrow Wilson's Global Economy Initiative. For those of you who are new to us, I want to just say a word or two about the Woodrow Wilson Center, and those of you who have heard this before, why, just put your hands over your ears for just a second. The Wilson Center is a living memorial to our 28th President, Woodrow Wilson. In 1968, the Congress wanted to honor the president, but decided against another marble statue, another monument on the mall, and created this living memorial. Wilson was the only president to have had a PhD, that in his era, he really was a very prominent political scientist. Went on to be president of Princeton, governor of New Jersey, and of course, a two-term president. So the assignment that the Congress gave us was to bring together the people, like our speaker today, who are doing the best thinking and writing and researching on public policy, together with many of the people in this room who are making or heavily influencing public policy. It is now my extraordinary pleasure, well, actually, let me thank a couple people. Liz Byers, who just walked out the door, is someone who is the real force behind Wilson Center on the Hill. And I wanted to thank Carolyn Bratz, who is here somewhere, and Georgina Ellison. Georgina, raise your hand. They're doing an internship with us and are absolutely invaluable. Now it is my pleasure to introduce Katherine Katie Lavelle. She is currently the Ellen and Dixon Long Associate Professor of World Affairs at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, Ohio. She really straddles that line between political science and international relationships, between international relations and the study of economics. It's a very important, but not really, I would say, underexplored niche in the academic world. She really partly got the bug for this. She had this idea beforehand, but she was an American Political Science Association fellow here on the House Financial Services Committee. And she was not only one of those fellows, in fact, she was the William Steiger Fellow, which was the outstanding fellow in her class. She then we had the good fortune of luring her to the Woodrow Wilson Center, where she spent a year, I would say, researching and working on this book. She brings to this not only that very interesting experience of actually being on the Hill, being in the front lines of legislating and the exercise of political influence on the Hill, but she brings, of course, an outstanding educational background, a BS or BA from Georgetown and a master's from University of Virginia and a PhD from Northwestern University. This, I think, if you are teaching Congress, even though the subject here seems particularly targeted at the bank and the fund and how the Congress exercises influence, she very nicely walks through different phases of the world of finance and how it changes, how the IMF and the World Bank have changed, but also how the Congress has changed. And I must say, were I teaching a class on Congress, this is one of the books I would certainly turn to. Katie, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Kent and Liz, and thank you for all of your efforts on behalf of putting this together today. And I also want to thank all of my friends and future friends who've come to hear this, particularly my friends from the fellowship program and certainly my friends from the Office of Financial Services and of course Daniel McGlinchey, my coworker, really stands out here because it's very intimidating to talk about this topic in front of Dan because he's one of the people who taught me everything I know about Congress and its interaction with the IMF and the World Bank. And so I appreciate all the support. I always say say that it takes a village to write a book, and I've really been lucky to have had so many good experiences here. We were saying before lunch that you don't have friends in Washington, and I'm definitely someone who's a professor who believes that you really do have friends in politics. There's the whole adage that politics are meaner in a university, and I actually do think that's true. And I've been very lucky to have so many friends here. So thank you. And I thought what I would do today is I want to leave time for questions and answers to hear what all of you want to contribute and the questions that you have. But I thought that I would talk a little bit about what is in the book. Like I say, for an academic audience, this might not be so necessary or more necessary for all of you. You're actually doing it, so you'll probably know more about that. But then I thought I would talk about why we should care about a lot of this, because everyone isn't specifically concerned with the bank and the fund. And then I thought I would try to project a little bit towards the future and think about where some of this is going. And so, and then leave it at that. So we have time for questions. But if we want to start out and say, first of all, well, what's actually in the book? Well, I'm a professor, and I wrote this book primarily for an academic audience, and I'm in international relations. And my field sees Congress at best as an obstacle to multilateral cooperation. So in terms of trying to get countries to cooperate and do what's best for all of them, Congress is viewed as an obstacle at best and a complete barrier at worst to getting countries to get along. And so I wanted to approach the project not just so much as how the Congress operates with respect to foreign affairs of the United States government, but how our legislature operates in world politics. So how it operates out there as an institution of global affairs. And that's a very different thing than just thinking about the role of Congress in U.S. foreign policy. So what I argue in the book is that Congress does this in two ways. It acts as a forum and as an actor itself. As a forum, it embodies the debates of the day in world politics. So it's a place where great debates take place, maybe not on the floor of the House or the Senate, but certainly in the work that a lot of you do in the offices on Capitol Hill. But it's also an actor in a way that a lot of actors aren't in world politics, because it actually has the resources to do something about those debates once it reaches a resolution to some of them. So in my field of international relations, we have our own debate about what the role of ideas is and how international politics operates. And so what I want to say to my friends who study Congress, who've never really thought about this international aspect of what Congress does, I want to argue to them that the international context matters for what members of Congress do when they act, and how members have shaped policy when they act in this context that the world, in my case, the world financial system has given them within which to act. But then I want to say to my friends on the international relations side, well, I want them to see how important reform initiatives can be generated outside of an international organization like the IMF and the World Bank. And those reform initiatives can be implemented by using a domestic political institution like the United States Congress. So a lot of the work that's done in my field is focused on bills and how bills become laws. And this is true. But I also want to point out that an awful lot of what bills do is induce cooperation and compliance in international financial institutions when they're seeking appropriations or when they need legislation for other matters. So even the threat to legislate can have an effect on an international organization in a way that, again, in the academic literature, I think is often overlooked. So as I said, what's in the book? Well, I talk about multilateralism, and what I mean by multilateralism is a framework through which we solve the world's problems, where countries come together and to determine an approach to a problem and at least try to have some organization in terms of how they achieve that result. And on the Congress side, I want to argue, based on my experiences here, as I said, I had a very positive experience here. I think that our Congress is a mirror of the American people. With all the diversity of the American people, all the good and the bad of their views, and all of their nasty disputes that take place. But I also think that despite the disputes that take place here, it's truly one of the world's great forms for deliberative democracy. And as Jeff Biggs would always remind me from the Congressional Fellowship Program, it's the first branch. Our founding fathers thought of this as the first branch of the American government. And so that was the approach that I took when I set out to explain this history between Congress and the bank and the fund. So what I do in the book, if you're interested in it, is I break down the relationship into stages. And I try to say in each stage how it is that the Congress acted and what happened with the IMF and the World Bank, as both were operating within this international context. So if you've done any kind of extensive policy studies, you probably already know that the way the policy literature looks at this is there's generally some kind of exogenous shock, and it opens some kind of policy window where people who previously had ideas about what they wanted to see done have the opportunity for change. Then things close down until there's another opportunity that comes along. So I've broken this down into 5 stages to say that when these major shocks came to the world economy, this is what was going on in the institution of Congress, and this is what is going on in the IMF and the World Bank. So the first of these, well, it started out as 5 stages, but it became 6 as the course of writing this book was taking place. But the 6 stages that I break down is, first of all, the enactment stage, when World War II ends. So the shock to the economy is obviously the Great Depression and then the resolution of that through the stimulus of the Second World War. And what I argue in this particular phase of the relationship is that members of Congress and members of civil society that wanted to see some kind of a multilateral solution to the world's problems had had a lot of experience with the League of Nations and the failure of the United States to join the League of Nations. So I spend a lot of time with the history of that because it seems very important to me what they learned. They were literally the same people. And if you really want to get into the procedural debates of the League of Nations passage or lack of passage, it had to do with the way Wilson bundled the legislation and not so much that a majority of members of the House and the Senate didn't support membership and didn't support multilateralism. And the thing that I'm really fond of pointing out is that even when we didn't join the League of Nations, we didn't just walk away from the institution. American philanthropies funded a large part of the health unit of the League. The Rockefeller Foundation, Rockefeller family, I should say, contributed a library to the League of Nations headquarters in Geneva that was so large that they had to move the location of the building when they were planning for the Palais des Nations in Geneva, and made it the best international studies library in Europe at the time. The Rockefeller Foundation funded up to 1/3 of the economic unit of the League of Nations and their expenses, and then housed them in Princeton, New Jersey during World War II so that they could continue their work when the war was raging on the European continent. Americans served on committees of the League. We just sent bankers, and they served on the financial committees of the League. And even members of Congress that were interested in their work participated in the activities. And so if you're really interested in this congressional history, it's interesting to me how they funded it out of a back door fund at the State Department, because it meant something to them that they were paying the American share, even though we were not officially members of the League. So I think that's really important, because in the enactment stage, when the Bretton Woods Agreement Act came before Congress, the people involved didn't forget what happened. So when they wanted to make sure that the United States took the forefront in these new organizations, they circulated drafts of proposals for the organizations prior to the meeting at Bretton Woods. They included members of Congress as well as banks in negotiating the process for Bretton Woods. This didn't guarantee that the individuals involved would support what happened after it was over, but throughout the hearings on the treaty, the members of Congress spoke directly to their experiences with the negotiation for the Bretton Woods Agreement and their understanding of the process and how difficult it is to negotiate an international agreement. And promoters of the Bretton Woods agreements worked ceaselessly to get civil society organizations out as some people have told me where I live, is the hinterlands. I always joke about that. But out in places like Ohio and Missouri and out in the rest of the country to understand why we needed an IMF and a World Bank and why they also needed to get on board to support these initiatives. So you had the whole thing enacted. Then I have the building stage of the relationship. Here, what I see happening in the international banking sector and the international context within which these institutions are operating is the restoration of international lending. So you know that the international banking system basically shut down during the war. So banks and other arrangements had to be reestablished, and people had to reestablish contact with their customers and whatnot. But also, when we look inside Congress, the work of Congress was very closed to much of what was going on in the American public. And so during what I call the building stage, the IMF and the World Bank reach out to the banking community, and they also reach out to large businesses to make them understand why they needed a multilateral framework within which to restore the world economy, why working together was something that would benefit everyone. Then the next stage I talk about is the development stage. And by development, I mean development of the former colonial world. And here the exogenous shock that comes to the world economy is the end of fixed parity in the IMF. So if you took any kind of course in the international financial system, you know that up until 1971 we had fixed parity and we had fixed exchange rates essentially in the IMF. So this is a shock to the IMF because it dramatically changes its work mandate, of course. But what I think the international relations literature misses is that there was an awful lot taking place in Congress at the same time. And what we see in American politics is the rise of issue advocacy. So we start to see just an explosion, as some authors call it, of activity of interest groups that are not necessarily aligned with a political party, but have a particular issue on their agenda. So they could shift from party to party, from bill to bill, depending on how their issue is packaged. The way the American politics literature talks about this is that it adds an additional layer of people to satisfy when legislation is going through Congress. But this has an effect because some of these issue advocacy groups are very interested in the kinds of lending programs and what's going on in the IMF and the World Bank. So it really changes the relationship in that stage. The next stage that I talk about, so we're up to the fourth stage, is the debt stage of development. And here when I say that there's an exogenous shock, the exogenous shock is the 1982 Mexican default. So this is where we have the initiation of a very serious kind of sovereign debt crisis in what we then called the developing world. So you have banks now that are very interested in seeing that legislation passes that will make sure that the IMF, has, in particular in this case, has the money that it needs to get appropriations. But you also have a problem in civil society with so-called bailouts of big banks that is taking place through the international financial institutions. As I said to someone, what was the other side of that debate? And one of the people involved said, well, it was a bailout. I was like, well, how did you get around that? And they said, well, that's what it was. It was a bailout. So anyway, again, to someone who only remembered it, not, kind of as a side issue, I hadn't thought of it that way. But anyway, this is very unpopular. Surprise, surprise. Bailouts are not popular with the American people in banking. So the internal change that allowed this legislation, that allowed this whole relationship to flourish, despite the problems that were out there in American civil society, I argue is this tendency of Congress to bundle. We see the rise of omnibus legislation and this packaging. So the idea here, again, what we learned from our friends in American politics, is that legislation, you hope that your issue, something like the IMF and the World Bank that isn't always the foremost on constituents' minds in most districts, you can hide it, essentially, in a larger package, and that will go through, and hopefully it won't attract attention, and then you can get your money and everyone can be happy. So throughout the 1980s, you see these different attempts made to bundle the appropriation and move it along. The next, what I thought was going to conclude the book when I started it, is the fifth stage, is the moral hazard, what I call the moral hazard stage of the relationship. And here, this is ushered in by the 1997 Asian financial crisis. So this is a completely different kind of financial crisis because, again, if you study international finance, you know that one is a sovereign debt crisis and the other is a liquidity crisis. They're essentially very different kinds of crises. And so here, the IMF is coming to the Congress and having, again, a need for an appropriation, and a massive fight breaks out. The internal change that changes the nature of the relationship, I argue, is here we have divided government in reverse. So in the initial instance of divided government, you had a Republican president with a Democratic Congress, with the Reagan administration, a Democratic Congress. But when the divided government in reverse, you have a Democratic president with a Republican Congress, and the Republican Congress is guided by the principles of the Contract with America, which is a very different way of, again, packaging legislation and taking it to committee chairs and whatnot. So different groups become involved. Different groups have success or failure in terms of operating within this relationship. By the end of that, so the moral hazard idea is just the whole sense that now these institutions are contributing to the problems of the world economy. They're not solving it. And so you have critics of the institution on both, particularly the IMF, on both the right and the left, arguing that maybe if they weren't making those loans, the crisis never would have happened in the first place, because there's this sense that they will bail out governments. So by the time I started this project, the IMF was searching for a mission. It was laying off employees for the first time in its history. The World Bank was likewise searching for some role that it could play. It was marketing itself as a development institution. And so I thought I was going to have a quiet year on the Hill, and I thought I would have a quiet year. Even when I got to the Wilson Center, I hadn't predicted what would come. So I'm fond of reminding my friends I got back to Washington in 2008, and 2 weeks later, Lehman Brothers collapsed. Wow, that was not what I was expecting for a quiet year. So my project changed, I always joke, more than anyone else's at the Wilson Center in the first 2 weeks that I was there. And then, of course, I had to write another chapter. So if you're an academic, you know, I don't work, you know, there goes the coffee shop. So there goes my time that I so enjoyed. As my colleagues on the Hill know, I enjoyed my afternoon coffees down here in the basement of the Rayburn office building. So this is ushered in what in the book I call the revived stage of the Congress IFI relationship, and it's unfortunately ushered in by the current financial crisis that has not reached its ultimate conclusion. So here I talk about the new relationship between the IMF and the World Bank, because the IMF comes to play a very different role. First of all, there's the consensus that we need a new Bretton Woods, that we need to get more funding for the IMF and the World Bank, that they have a new mandate, they have a role to play. Some leaders think that we even need to rewrite them altogether. And then there's a new problem on Capitol Hill, obviously because of the demands for funding that are so much more intense now in our own era that we live in. So that's kind of a very brief overview of what the book tries to do. It's historical. I'm not a political scientist who tries to code any variables here. It's really very much an individual story of how this legislation comes through and what policy measures groups were able or not able to enact as a result of it. But I want to spend a little bit of time saying why should we care, because a lot of you are not, in fact most of you are probably not academics and kind of wonder why should we care. Well, we live in an era, I don't need to tell you, that is certainly one that is characterized by a great deal of international financial turmoil. And what I think this book teaches us is that if we are going to have an international response, elites cannot just say, this is what we need, and then expect the political system to take care of itself. The American political system will not just take care of itself. What I really like about the history that I developed from going to the archives and talking to people who lived it is the whole notion that we need to incorporate members of Congress as well as their staffs at a very early stage. And we also need to draw in business groups and labor groups and civil society groups. And as someone who's a professor and believes very much in the power of education, education of the American public is a very, very important part of this mission. So there needs to be a consensus-driven process moving forward, because this type of legislation on the Hill has a very high degree of volatility. In order for the legislation to pass, it needs to have a very wide coalition, and one that I would argue is essentially by its nature bipartisan. But a very wide bipartisan coalition, history shows us, tends to break up very rapidly. They don't tend to be stable coalitions. And so we need a great amount of education to counteract the effects of financial politics and the lack of interest that a lot of people have. Because let's face it, when I started this project, someone said to me, nobody studies that because it's boring. That kind of summed it up at that point. So that's why I think that we should care. But when we look to the future, where do I see any of this going? Well, I think that the history shows us that globalization has been a process that has been driven since the end of the Second World War from the ground up, as well as from the top down. So it really hasn't just been elites driving globalization and telling people what to do. It's really been people's participation, and participation that has become increasingly connected, person to person. So, I mean, many of you probably know with what's gone on in a lot of the Arab Spring movement. I have students who will tell me they're on their Twitter and their Facebook accounts, and they're directly communicating with students in other countries. So this kind of globalization on political issues that takes place between people directly is something very new, but it's also something that has a history. The technological means are new, but it has a very long history. So we have to allow for this top-down but also bottom-up globalization. I'm really fond of reminding people of the anti-globalization movement that was very active on college campuses from about 1994 to 2004. And I think we seem to forget shut down major cities in connection to trade issues. Previously, when we talked about problems with civil society and globalization, it was all about trade. Certainly, if you're from the Midwest and the so-called Rust Belt, you know that generally that's what mobilized workers. That's what got people out to march. But the anti-globalization movement of those years left several unresolved questions for the world economy. And the questions that it left were, whose responsibility is it to fix the system? And is it primarily the responsibility of developing countries? Because remember, that was the old development. It was a question of whether or not we're talking about developing countries versus developed. So is it their responsibility to fix their own problems? Or is it the entire world community's responsibility to fix these problems? This question was never answered. And now we're faced with a crisis where we have essentially the same question, except the fault line isn't necessarily between developed and developing countries anymore, because that's been the biggest change for the IMF and the World Bank. Now we're talking, or not the World Bank, but the IMF. We're talking about industrial countries who need loans. But it's also not so much focused on trade. It's focused on financial issues as well. But I want to argue that we actually, going to the future, have the same questions in terms of whose responsibility is it to fix the system? Is it the responsibility of people who live in the countries that are the borrower countries? Or is it the responsibility of the entire system to figure out some way of resolving these problems in an organized manner and, and to deal with the problem of global imbalances in a way that Kent and I are fond of discussing never was really resolved with the original Bretton Woods Agreement. There was never any kind of mechanism between the World Trade, or what would have been the Trade Organization, the IMF, and the World Bank, that if you had reached a conclusion in one institution, how were you going to get some kind of balance in the other institutions? Those were unanswered questions, and they continue to haunt us. So I welcome your questions, and I welcome the discussion, and I really want to thank everyone for coming here today.
We welcome lots of questions. We always give priority to congressional staff. Just please, if you'd raise your hand, and we'll get a microphone to you right away. Well, while we're waiting, people get warming up their questions. I have one about the IMF. That later today, I've got to talk about Europe and the Eurozone and what's happening to the Euro and what that's going to mean for the developing world. The IMF is now suddenly drawn into looking at the entire Eurozone. What role might the IMF be able to play in this circumstance for developing countries that are not making headlines but are facing those debt challenges themselves?
Well, you know, just to answer that question, I'll get back to where I left off. When we think about the problems of developing countries and the Eurozone, it's very difficult to separate that from these unresolved trade questions. And with the breakdown of the Doha round negotiations, I'm not sure that we can ultimately resolve the questions of the Eurozone because of the special trading relationships that so many countries in Europe have with their former colonies. And maybe I'm biased here because my background was in African studies. And so I'm thinking of the old colonial relationships in Africa that still exist in terms of trade. And so some European countries have very different needs when it comes to buying and establishing finance in the developing world. So I would say what I guess it's easy because I know you agree with this, that somehow you have to come up with some mechanism of addressing the imbalance that isn't strictly a financial answer, but that is also based in trade relationships that can contribute to the underlying financial problems.
Yes, the gentleman in the back there, please.
Somebody else. This question may be something
Please
I'm Doug
introduce
Bellis.
yourself, if you will.
Yeah, I'm Doug Bellis from House Legislative Counsel's office. And this question is probably something I really ought to just read your book to find out. But I was intrigued by what I thought I understood you to say, that in the context of Wilson trying to get U.S. participation in the League of Nations, his strategic mistake was trying to bundle all of the legislative stuff that was needed into one bundle and trying to get it through at one time. Whereas you mentioned later on, excuse me, that with the IMF and other things like that in later years, the strategy was actually to unbundle stuff and kind of put a little bit here, a little bit there. And I was kind of interested in what do you see as the institutional changes in Congress or the coincidences? Why were we, just 100 years apart or so? What's with that?
Well, that's a great question, and I think, especially if you're at the Wilson Center, it haunts you, because if you know anything about Woodrow Wilson, you know what a great legislator he was. And you don't at least I couldn't understand, and I've had a lot of discussions with Wilson scholars about why he was so successful in getting through so much progressive legislation early in his presidency, and particularly the legislation for the Federal Reserve, which had just been a really thorny question for years with financial crisis that preceded it. And then how could he have had his legacy be this failed piece of legislation? And so I may have been somewhat imprecise in terms of how I talked about Wilson. I think that the underlying problem with the League of Nations was a problem of the balance of powers in the United States government, that ultimately what certain members of Congress, and perhaps I'm being sympathetic to them here because I worked here and I have a lot of sympathy for what people do here, and I think Congress should play a role. So I'm a fan of balance of powers, unlike the Wilsonian side that would like to see more of an executive authority. The fear was that the power to declare war in the Treaty of Versailles would have, or the way the League was bundled with the Treaty of Versailles, would have rested with State Department appointees at the League. So you would have had that power to declare war taken out of the Congress, essentially, and you would have shifted what the original Madisonian intention had been in U.S. foreign policy. So there was ultimately that underlying question. Wilson argued that because that would have progressed through the Senate appointment process, and he had a defense for that, but I'm not sympathetic to his defense. Now, then people argue that you could have modified the treaty, and then the scholars will argue whether or not that would have worked. But from my perspective, you had that problem in Congress that transcended just the fact that people basically wanted to belong to the League, and they certainly wanted to participate in all the philanthropic and health and economic and all the other activities of it. Up until the World War II, they had actually negotiated an arrangement where they would modify the League and make it possible for the United States to join the social activities without officially joining the security apparatus. But Wilson was intent on combining membership in the League and the Covenant of the League with the Treaty of Versailles. And ultimately, there was no way to conclude the war. The United States concluded its own resolution to World War I with Germany in the worst possible manner that Wilson never would have gone for. And so it was his, if you want to call it, stubbornness in wanting to keep that legislative package together. It only had 2 votes in Congress. And again, I'd have to check the figures on this, but it always got a majority. It was always popular. There were, and going forward, it was always popular. So it's a different kind of a bundling context later, because there's not the same Congress and the same IMF and World Bank in every one of these stages. By the time you get later, there's all kinds of information flooding in. People have all kinds of information about what is going on in the IMF and the World Bank. So now you have human rights groups that don't like it, that they're making loans in XYZ countries and whatever. So it's there's a very different kind of political activity that actually means you want to hide it instead of get the message out. And so it really depends on the way each institution is configured at each moment in history. I'm in a little bit of an academic debate here with some of my colleagues who use roll call votes as if they are consistent across time. The way a roll call occurred in 1920 does not, in my argument, mean the same thing as a roll call vote today. They're very different things. And there is almost a complete avoidance of having any sort of roll call vote on the floor of the House or the Senate on something that is purely IMF or World Bank related. So that's just a very different kind of a scenario. But I love that history, because I don't understand why.
Gentleman there, then the gentleman here.
Certainly. Sergio Pombo from the International Finance Corporation. I'm really glad that this book is written, and also that you had the coaching of Daniel McClinchy and the right people here in Congress. As we move forward in history and the present, how do you advise this crowd to be much more knowledgeable about what the international institutions do, and how can they, with this information, influence more the institutions to accomplish what the United States think should be done with these institutions?
Yeah, I don't want to throw it back on the World Bank. I do think that the institutions themselves need to project what role they see. So I'm not really sure that civil society groups or anyone outside the institution, and I know that what people have told me when I say that as well, you know, they have states as members. They are what their members say, and so if they can't say it, if their members don't agree with it. But I would argue then that that the members who are promoting what they want to see them do in the world community need to be able to go out to places like Kansas and Ohio and Florida and explain to someone who doesn't have a job why it would be more important to support an international organization that would be involved in bailing out segments of the world that they may consider themselves to have nothing to do with, and as opposed to doing something about a problem that their neighbor is unemployed or a member of their family is unemployed or something about the local economy. I think those questions could be answered. They were answered in the aftermath of the Great Depression. Within 10 years, you had active civil society elements working on multilateral solutions to world problems after they passed the Smoot-Hawley tariff. So people can see how bad things are when there isn't cooperation, or when there's kind of ad hoc cooperation and there's no plan, and then something happens and there's no way of resolving it. It is very possible to go out and explain this to people, but I think that I'm reluctant to provide my own kind of advice because I feel like, well, maybe that's what the agencies themselves should be doing. But I am also very acutely aware that they would say, certainly in terms of parliamentary outreach, they have a problem by treaty insofar as they are prohibited from actively lobbying on the Hill. I'm a little curious about that because I've been told repeatedly that they are prohibited by treaty from doing that, and yet I checked congressional official lobbyists, and there actually have been instances where they have hired lobbyists, professional lobbyists in Washington. But there are some prohibitions on actively doing that. But an educational outreach doesn't necessarily just have to be immediately to members of Congress and their staffs. As you know, a lot of what people do is come into the staff and say, look, this is how it affects what's going on in my district. And that's much more effective for members of Congress who are maybe not at the leadership level on some of these issues. But a lot of other people, if you can demonstrate to them, look, you have a lot of exports in this part of the world, and the reason those exports are taking place is because this institution has developed that market and has been financing business there, and this has allowed you to have this relationship. I think you can do it. You can speak directly to people on that kind of level, like takes place every day on the Hill, and I think that that's what's needed.
So, gentleman here.
Hi, Nils Bjorksten from the Congressional Research Service. There's been some discussion lately about changing the governance of the IMF and the World Bank to reflect the increasing importance of the emerging markets. And I was wondering if you could comment on the congressional role in that debate.
Well, it's been a debate. I mean, I think that what you've seen mostly from the United States side is a support for giving more of a role for emerging markets, like you point out, and the reluctance has been European countries who would like to preserve the role that they have, which is really declined since the end of the Second World War, and perhaps their representation should take place in a bloc. But then how active and what kinds of instruments the United States Congress wants to use, some members are going to care more than others, and so it seems to me that that there has been support for it, and it just has been a problem within the institution.
A gentleman there.
Thank you. I'm Akira Chiba of the Japanese Embassy. I realize that there may be various reasons that encourage members of Congress to be interested in the IMF and World Bank, but can that be boiled down to a couple of points, such as they come from New York or Charlotte and it's in their constituency's interest, or they've got a huge bank on board their re-election committee, or they're genuinely interested in taxpayers' money?
Well,
This gentleman clearly has gotten a lot of Washington experience.
but you know what's fascinating is how little of that. I think you're right. A lot of it depends on what moment in history we're talking about. You can't deny that in the 1980s there was an awful lot of what we used to call the money center banks that were primarily located in New York or Charlotte that were active behind the scenes on these issues. My understanding is that banks, and this is the last time I discussed this with someone would be about a year ago, so this might have changed, is that what we would call kind of the big money center, what's left of the big money center banks have not been active in lobbying on the bank and the fund for at least, I'd say, 10 years. That it really, when you think of the way capital markets have disintermediated since that time, so much money flows to the developing world through what we would call disintermediated credit, which would be bonds, which would be directly going into the bond market. Really, there would be much more interest in how those bondholders are acting. And so much of the political activity has surrounded so-called vulture funds and that kind of financial activity. And so there you would have a constituent interest. Certainly, there's a lot of interest in what the bank and the fund do in human rights. So that could be anywhere. Any member of Congress who cares deeply about human rights would be someone who would be receptive to arguments about activities of the bank and the fund that detract from human rights, be it through commodities exchanges. I think there's been a lot of work on hunger and work of some of the prominent American investment banks that have taken away from have made food markets volatile. So there's been a lot of activity there. There's been a lot of activity in the environment, which, again, cuts across geographic constituencies. So these are the kind of issue advocacy groups I was talking about, where it isn't necessarily in just one district or another, but it's also not consistent. Sometimes it's something very specific that the bank or the fund are doing, and then it would have a tendency to fall off. So it's something that, for this reason, Congress scholars have not looked at before. So most of my friends who are pure Americanists would say, well, who cares about that? That's got to be the last thing anyone cares about in Congress. And it's, in some respects, it isn't something that's very prominent on the congressional agenda. But for those of us who come from the development studies community, it matters deeply to the majority of the world's population that has lived with the policies of the IMF and the World Bank since the end of the war, up until the current crisis, where now the argument is certainly widened to include people who are living in Europe and are faced with austerity programs that the bank, or the fund rather, wants to institute. But up until 2008, it was really a development issue. And yeah, I mean, in some ways, it speaks to the concern that the American people have. I when I was here, worked on Darfur issues. So they're not, obviously, if you work here, that people work on different issues. The thing that just really impressed me about that is how many people came in and really cared about Darfur who have nothing to do with it. They're not Muslim. They're not African. They're college students, and maybe you could say they have time on their hands. But I could, at that moment in time, before I got here and I was in African studies, I could have just had a whole cottage industry and a career in Darfur. The number of speaking engagements people wanted, the amount of attention that was being devoted to it here. And it really kind of lifted me up, because we have no strategic interest. As of now, we're not that's not an oil supplier for the United States. It's much more important to China. So you could say, what kind of interest? You could say we have oil's fungible. You might make a sideways argument. But Darfur, right now, maybe we think oil's coming out of Darfur in the future, but that's really more a North-South Sudan issue. It's not. So, I mean, it really, there are some of these issues out there that people just care because they care. And a question I get from professors is always, why does an individual member of Congress then care? And here it gets a lot more tricky, because I can speculate about the member of Congress I worked for and why he cares. But I don't know, because I don't know why I care. I always take it back to myself. And I think, if you ask me, why did I want to do this? I might tell you one day, yesterday morning it was because I went to a Catholic school. Today it might be because I worked with great people on the Hill. I mean, any human, we're talking about humans, but there certainly are members. What impresses me is that members of Congress, in many ways, we talk about how we don't have an institutional bureaucracy the way European countries do, but the career spans of people who have been active on these issues, so I always try to, bipartisan, people like Chairman Frank, but also people like Chuck Hagel on the Senate side, Nancy Pelosi, obviously Senator Fulbright for much of his career, were here for a very long time and really do know a lot about these issues. And they've made that a chunk of their career. In a way, a presidential administration is 8 years max. So, you have people who have 30 and 40 years of following the bank and the fund on the Hill and their staff that really know the nuances of what's going on up to the minute. And then, in some pockets of the Treasury or, other parts, the State Department, you probably find career civil servants who are similarly deeply involved in the issues. But I don't like the way we look at it sometimes as if there's kind of U.S. foreign policy, leave that to the executive, and those are the people who've been there. And when our executive has the degree of turnover, and in many places in Congress on some of these issues, we have a lot of people who've been very involved for across 20 and 30 years in Congress.
I would add that so many of us are small W Wilsonians and feel it is still something of a national mission to make the world safe for democracy and human rights and civil society. Gentleman right there at the distinguished gentleman, I should say.
The distinguished gentleman behind me. Jeff Biggs from the American Political Science Association. I don't know what sort of consensus emerged out of the Depression, but it seems to me that today we have competing policy objectives, which we have not resolved domestically, whether it's the deficit versus growth and jobs. The Eurozone is having a tough time figuring that out because austerity in Greece impedes growth, and for the economy to get out of this, you have to have growth. You got China, where 1/3 of the credit is subterranean at usurious rates. What are the obstacles to coming up with a consensus that, in fact, resolves these competing policy objectives?
Well, those of us in political science like to think of the consensus that came out of the Great Depression is what we would call the compromise of embedded liberalism. And the compromise of embedded liberalism really was embodied in the Bretton Woods institutions. So the idea here is that you have free market capitalism, that you will have a market economy, but that it will be controlled by the state, and the state will promote full employment. And at the international level, you will promote stability, but you will give states the autonomy in the IMF's fixed exchange rate system. You will promote autonomy so that the government can pursue its own mechanism to promote full employment in this capitalist economy. And I think most political scientists would agree that that was the ideology that underpinned the post-war financial institutions, but also national governments. If you ask me what's going on right now, it seems to me that the compromise of embedded liberalism is blown to smithereens. So we have no consensus. How did we get to that consensus at the end of the Depression? Well, it took a long period of extended, unfortunate suffering and misery and a war. We don't want to see that happen. But right now, we're living in an era where, if we like it or not, I'd like to know how this story is going to end, but I don't know how. I know the story is not over. And, as we were talking about yesterday morning, the Depression, 1929, the stock market crashed, and then the banking crisis was 1933. So when people started celebrating, I went to a talk at the Peterson Institute when I was at the Wilson Center, and a prominent member of the Obama administration said, "We fixed the problem, it's solved." Well, I'm back home for 2 years, and that problem is not solved. And so I would say, we count forward to 1933, and we're faced with the specter of another recession in Europe. Then we know that there was another recession or depression during the so-called Great Depression in 1938. And I think most economic historians would tell us that the result of that the Depression would not have been resolved if we had not entered World War II, when the massive stimulus that occurred from World War II. So we're looking at 10 years of depression. This is not a very happy topic, but we're in the middle of this right now. And if you want to think of it as a problem, but what's happened is we have a social safety net. So things really didn't bottom out to the extent that they could have to force some of these issues where you would start to have mass-based social movements like we saw with Huey Long in the American South and these things from taking place. So that process has been stalled. You saw it on the right initially with the Tea Party movement, and now you're seeing it on the left with this Occupy Wall Street movement, where you might say, well, how much does that really matter? I've had a hard time trusting the news on a lot of that. So when I was in New York last week, I went down myself because I found the media coverage to be strangely ignored, and now strangely, I'll offer my opinion here, strangely overblown. So so you're starting to see a dialogue, but it's not necessarily a dialogue with the left and the right. It is a dialogue out in places like Ohio where people are saying, why has it taken this long to get the other side, to hear the stories of the unemployed, to hear why we are paying for the sins of others, and why is the American dream not working? Why is it that I work hard, I send my kids to a school at Midwest, prominent Midwest university like Case Western, and they can't find jobs when they're an engineer? I mean, these are the people who did not have great aspirations to work on Wall Street. These are people who thought that they, if they were an electrical engineer from a solid engineering school, they were not going to be facing unemployment. So what it's causing them to do is reassess. I mean, I don't think they would self-describe it, but I'm an academic, so I will. I think they're reassessing the compromise. I'll speak for them. Why not? They're reassessing the compromise of embedded liberalism, and they're asking these questions about what is the role of the state in all of this? What role do we want to see the government play? And what role do we want to see in the government playing in fixing this at the international level? What responsibilities do we have to the international community? And how is working in the international community going to make this better or worse? And I think, unfortunately, we're in the process of working that out. It is just going to be a great intellectual debate, but it's an intellectual debate that's going to be, unfortunately, informed by what forces are going to come at us exogenously from the internet, because we don't know what's going to happen in Europe. We don't know what is going to happen in China. We haven't even touched the Chinese banking system and all of this. We assume, they've got all the money, they can lend us the money, they're stable. I mean, anyone who studies domestic Chinese financial politics would question that. So there's a lot that can happen. But unfortunately, when I say this to people who lived through the Depression, I say, but then you got 40 years of middle class prosperity, and you all could buy a house. And then I tell my students, this is tape recorded, my parents get to go on a cruise in their retirement. A school teacher and a plumbing salesman, they send their kids to college. Now they get to have a nice retirement with health care. No one my age looks to that future. So they start to question what role they want the government to play in either taking that future away from them or giving it back to them, and we're just out in the middle of it, and we don't know.
Katie, let me ask.
I'm that happy.
No, I know.
Enjoy your lunch, everyone.
Got me thinking, because I've
Hope
got
there's
to
some dessert left.
talk about that subject at 3 o'clock, so I'm going to, being a country boy from Oregon, I always try to find the glass that's half full. Well, this one's empty right now.
And despite how many times I try to convince you, it's not half full.
Let me ask you to look to the future again, that parallel to the bank and the fund and those global institutions, including the World Trade Organization, you've had a club of key countries that have played a big role. We, as the U.S., saw the need for greater coordination in the 1970s. We had the G7. And now, really one of the memorable things I think President George W. Bush did was to say, in this current crisis, the post-Lehman crisis, we need to look to the G20, a group that really had been formed in many ways by Paul Martin of Canada. But it was a group of finance ministers, and President Bush elevated that to the presidential or prime ministerial level. Going forward, they represent that weighting that is not yet present to some extent in either the bank or the fund. So you've got China, Brazil, India as important parts of the G20. If there is a secretariat of the G20, how do you see the Congress playing a role in shaping, responding to, anticipating where the G20 might take the global economy?
Well, the G20, I would see the Congress playing the role in getting to the moment where you're going to make a secretariat. I think that the Congress would play a very intense role before that would happen. And the reason I say that is because when I look at the G20, in international relations, again, if you took a basic course, you know, there's realists and there's idealists, and I'm very firmly entrenched in the realist camp on this one. So I always say the G20, I don't like the G and I don't like the 20. I don't like the G because it's a group, and I'm like, what is this? There's no treaty, there's no whatever. There's a picture that's taken and it looks nice. But there's no teeth behind this. They don't have an army, whatever. Okay. The 20 is coming out of my development studies. The problem I have with the 20 is that there's too many to actually get something done and get a consensus where you can move forward. But there's too few that my old friends in African politics feel excluded. They feel like this is not a representative institution. This is not something that we want to see in the world economy as what we would call legitimate, because a legitimate international institution would have a representation of all peoples, not just the G20 would say, what are they, 80% of the world economy or 90% of the world economy? But are you going to incorporate human life in all of this and say there's plenty of poor people, and just because they're poor shouldn't mean that they were excluded from these processes? So I would anticipate, before you move from a G20 to some kind of real representative institution with a secretariat, you would have, with anything that needed any kind of funding or anything official, you would have a wicked fight over that, because those people and their representatives would object. But I will say that I've said this with people, some of my colleagues. What they like about the G20 is that they have told me in the preparatory meetings, this is the one place where you bring China and India in, and you know what they're thinking and what they're talking about. And they think I'm a little too harsh, and I don't want to write them off as pie-in-the-sky idealists, because I respect them greatly. And what they tell me is that actually that process has been very useful, and to the extent that it extends to informing congressional staffs about what's going on, they have been able to gauge where other countries are, and in that sense, maybe they're the realists because they are this systematically important to the world economy. So I don't want to say that I don't think that something can't grow out of it, but I do think that there would be a legislative fight before you could get something really more permanently enshrined in treaty law.
There have been, let me just ask one last question if there's no other, and this is a little bit off the subject of your book, but there have been periodic expressions of interest in Asia about forming an Asian bloc. And partly that was stimulated by, I think, what most people would say, not very good advice that the IMF gave in the wake of the Asian financial crisis. At one point there was interest in Japan in having a yen bloc and so forth. China now hints that at some point in the future the renminbi or the yuan will be an internationally traded currency, and they see that as forming a real alternative to the dollar world. You see this happening, let's say, over the next 10 years, some real alternative to the IMF emerging if the IMF itself doesn't change its governance structure?
Yeah, well, at different moments, people have speculated about whether or not regional is more appropriate. To me, the way production works in the world economy, and you're certainly an expert more than I am on this, but the way production patterns have changed, the basis of a regional either trade or financial system are undercut because people's customers are no longer regional, and the production itself takes place in so many different parts of the world that are not necessarily regional, that will ultimately trump some of this regionalism in world politics. When I teach, again, in my day job, I teach U.S. foreign policy. U.S. foreign policy used to be something that was overwhelmingly Latin America. We spent weeks on Latin America. That was what we worried about. Now, books about U.S. foreign policy pay very cursory attention to Latin America, and it's all about Asia. So if you want to use that as a gauge for where people's interest and where scholarship is on the future of American strategic and economic relations, it's more appropriate for me to think about it in those respects than just thinking in terms of territory, despite the fact that there have been several very important initiatives that you've pointed out.
Well, we have reached our magic hour. We always promise to get you out of here by 1:15, so you can get back to your offices if you need to do that. But before we go, just let me remind you that on your table there are cards that you can fill out expressing an interest in some other program at the Wilson Center. We're delighted to let you know when those take place we really have programs that cover the world, and then, like my own, a number that are cross-cutting. And we're not allowed to sell books here, but if we did, this would be one that I would urge you to buy. It really is a very insightful look, not just at the fund and the bank, but at the workings of the U.S. Congress. Please join me in a round of applause for a terrific talk.